Chris, talk to me about how you define consciousness. I think I'm going to use your paper, "The Neural Basis of Consciousness," as the foundation for how I'm going to approach the questions for this interview. How would you
Right.
define consciousness, and why is it important to make certain differentiations? For example, contents of consciousness versus level of consciousness. Yeah, let's run through that.
Well, I follow most people in defining consciousness as having subjective experiences. And I think that the distinction between level and content is important because it probably involves different ways of doing the experiments and thinking about the brain systems involved. So level of consciousness, at one extreme, a high level of consciousness, you are having subjective experiences. And then, of course, you can go into a low level, sometimes, for example, people who are in this minimally conscious state after brain injury, they will sometimes have contents of consciousness, but maybe not. And then when you're unconscious or in coma, you're not having any subjective experiences. Now, contents of consciousness is, of course, is talking about what are the subjective experiences. And in particular, I and many others in the brain imaging world have been fascinated by the observation that when we are conscious, we are aware or conscious of some things that are impinging on us and not aware of other things that are impinging on us. And perhaps the most famous example of that is which I'm sure you have seen, the video of the gorilla. So this is where you're instructed to watch this video, and there are people playing basketball or something, and they're in red shirts and white shirts, and you have to count how many times the people in the white shirts pass the ball to each other. And at the end, you ask them, "Did you see the gorilla?" And they say no. Even though if you hadn't been given that instruction, had been looking for other things, you'd have obviously noticed the gorilla. So there are many situations where you can show that even though your senses are being stimulated, this doesn't actually reach awareness. Mm-hmm. It goes into the brain, but it doesn't become conscious. And that's exciting because you can then ask the question, what's the difference between the brain activity associated with things that you're aware of and the brain activity associated with things that you respond to but are not aware of? Mm-hmm. Now, in that case, that's not about the level of consciousness, because in both, this is the level is the same, but then you're aware of some things and not of others. And that's why I think that's important.
I mean, it's also important for us clinically, because you're working obviously as from a clinical perspective. I mean, even myself as a doctor, we have to know, we use the Glasgow Coma Scale or whatever sort of scale to try and differentiate between how conscious someone is versus how conscious they're not. But it's very different from subjectivity. When it comes to the neural basis of consciousness, Chris, how often do you get, let's say, feedback from people in a negative manner, trying to tell you that there's no way to find a neural basis of something that is subjective? The neural correlates of consciousness do not exist, and it's merely correlations. How often do you get this, and what are your responses to that?
Well, in a sense, they are correlations. That's why we call them the neural correlates of consciousness. So they don't, as on their own, explain how consciousness emerges or why consciousness emerges. So one often gets this question. And I guess I would want to say the way I would try get around this problem is to start asking questions about what is the function of consciousness? What is it for? And as I say in the paper, I think that consciousness is a sort of biological phenomenon. It's rather than something that physicists can tell us about. And that means that I think it evolved so that in early organisms were not conscious. And it's only more recently in evolutionary time that consciousness has emerged. And from that point of view, you have to say it must have had some advantage. It must have given some advantage in order for it to emerge. And then you can you can ask very difficult questions like, at what point in evolution did it emerge? What sort of creatures are conscious, and what sort of creatures are not conscious? And that's beginning to approach a sort of mechanistic idea, because if you can work out what consciousness is for, what advantages it gives you, and then you can look at the neural correlates of that, you might start to think about how you could actually make something conscious, which I'm talking about AI now. I mean, what would you have to, how would you program a computer or a robot so that it actually was conscious? I say I have no idea, but anyway.
I was just going to ask you, like, what are your thoughts? That was something I was going to ask you about later on. I mean, if this is something that has evolved, it must have other ways of evolving. I mean, if natural selection has done this, possibly artificial selection is going to do the same with us. So do you think it's possible for us to do this? Considering that the framework we use today, I mean, you're using the Bayesian brain framework. I mean, for the listeners, just so I can give them some context, I've quoted you in my dissertation a couple of times, and I mean, I used your work to help my work, and so thank you for that. First of all, your contributions to the field. But the way you guys approach it, I mean, Friston, yourself, I've read so many of you guys' papers. It's very much part of this Bayesian framework, and we'll talk about its implications with schizophrenia, etc., later on. But do you think we're going to do this with AI?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I remember, this has been sort of floating around for a long time, even before we got DeepMind and all these people. I remember about 30 years ago going to a meeting where an engineer was presenting this computer which he had programmed to show attention. It could attend to some things and not to other things. And he was saying, isn't this amazing? And this is probably the basis of consciousness. And then some elderly philosopher in the back of the lecture theatre got up and said, have you got ethical permission to turn it off?
It's a very good question.
So that's sort of been hanging around. But there are all sorts of ethical implications of this. I think, I mean, I don't know what the timeline is. I suspect not in my lifetime will we have a conscious robotic type device. But one of the questions that I have asked the roboticists who are trying to develop these sort of things is, it's all very well developing this in this way, but the question I would ask, how would you know when you had achieved your conscious machine? I think that's one of the most difficult questions to answer.
Yeah, because it's so blurry, the lines. I mean, where do we draw these lines? It was the same with humans. We made the Ian Vital. I mean, what is life? What is not life? I mean, blurry questions.
That's a very good. I mean, I'm very interested in that, because I think in the olden days, like in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, there was no distinction between life and consciousness. If you gave it life, you also gave it consciousness. And of course, the monster in the original is hyper-conscious. Doesn't bear any relation to the thing in the film version. And what's changed, as you were indicating, is that we now have a very good idea of what life is, and in some sense can make it with our, genetic manipulations and so on. And it's very much become divorced now from consciousness. So we would probably be happy to say that viruses are not conscious, amoeba are probably not conscious. So this distinction has now been made, but the big problem now is, as you say, is at what point does consciousness emerge, and how do we know that?
Exactly. Do you think that every time science makes progress in a certain field, doubters and skeptics will find another way of adding a layer of importance to us somehow?
Yeah. Yes, well, I may be responsible for doing that myself, as we will see later on, probably. I mean, I tend to show thought disorder, you'll discover. So there's an example of this, I think, in psychiatry. There's a very nice book that I had to review for Brain, which is about the sort of history of psychiatry. And what was fascinating is that as soon as some psychiatric disorder is resolved, it ceases to be part of psychiatry. So you had, what was it, tertiary syphilis, which at one point, most of the mental hospitals had patients with this. And then it was resolved and it was discovered precisely what it was. And then it ceased to be psychiatry and also was more or less cured. And the same with epilepsy. That used to be part of psychiatry, but it's now part of neurology. Huntington's chorea, now part of neurology, and so on and so on. So psychiatry is always left with the things that no one can explain. And I think that's the same process that you're suggesting. Even if we explain consciousness, there'll be something else. Or I think what will happen is there are all sorts of different aspects of consciousness, and it will probably divide up into different things, and people who already have different definitions of it. And there'll always be parts of it that we haven't resolved yet. And the ones that we have resolved will say, well, that wasn't really part of that's not what I meant by consciousness.
So, Chris, what do you think then about those people who say that, subjective experience is merely just a form of introspection? Daniel Dennett, Keith Frankish, this is just something we think we have, and it's just because we're articulating it to ourselves, and selves obviously inverted commas there. But what are your thoughts on illusionism then as a theory of consciousness?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects that I don't really understand the idea that consciousness is an illusion because we all experience it. I'm more sympathetic, although the idea is wrong, to the idea that it has no function. And this goes back actually at least as far as Thomas Huxley, who had this nice metaphor. He says, consciousness is like the whistle of a steam engine. It has absolutely no effect on the functioning of the steam engine. And my response to that is it has a big effect on the functioning of other steam engines.
Good response. And that's exactly why at some point, when you're talking about other species interacting and humans, how important it is for social interaction. Social
yes, exactly.
interaction, that's where you go about with this.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you want to touch on that? Let's talk about that. Let's get to that topic for a while.
Well, I'm trying to remember. One of the problems in the studying neural base of consciousness, and indeed studying subjective experience in general, is that we know about our own subjective experience, but we don't know about anybody else's. And we rely on them telling us about it, which is, as you say, is to do with introspection. And this, in fact, has a long, in psychological terms, has a long history, because this is what Fechner was doing in 1860, which is called psychophysics, which you basically make a noise and you say, how loud was that? Which is a subjective report. And you get very, very robust, reliable results using this. You can show that loudness, follows was it an exponential scale in relation to the actual physical intensity of the stimulus. It's very robust, so it really works. And then it went into disrepute because of behaviorism coming in and saying you can't trust these reports. And I think that's because people just didn't do the reporting properly. But certainly in the studies of the neural basis of consciousness, you have to say, for example, were you aware of the gorilla or not, for example? And you rely on, or you can have slightly more sophisticated ones where you say, how aware of the gorilla were you on a 4-point scale or something? And then some people say, well, this is all very well, but when you see these neural activity, is it because of making the report rather than just the experience? And my answer to that is that the ability to make the report is actually a very important part of the experience, because this is this rather wonderful thing that humans especially can do, is we can tell each other about our subjective experiences. And I think, and we could get onto that, but I think this actually creates all sorts of advantages which we can measure. And that gives you one reason why this ability might have evolved. But I used to believe, I couldn't really quite understand how you could have conscious experience without being able to, without knowing about it or being able to report it. But I'm now persuaded that there is an earlier stage where you have the experience, but in a sense you're not aware of it, you're aware of the stimulus, but you're not aware of being aware of the stimulus. And this is this higher level, sometimes called meta-consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when we're studying human consciousness, the fact that we can report it is actually a very important aspect of the experience.
But then how important then do you think linguistics plays a role here? Because we obviously can't express ourselves as great as we think we do. I mean, there's so much more going on inside here compared to what I can articulate to you. So do you think that's actually could be a hindrance to the way we try and express ourselves to each other?
Well, I think in a sense, there's too much. If we try to express everything, we'd collapse. And there's some work called coarse grainy or something that you can actually, by using these clever ways of reducing what we're talking about to some simplified system, we can actually get a better account of it than if we tried to put the whole thing across. So there is that aspect of it. But I think also by talking to each other, we can discover, first of all, what are the important things to tell each other about? And secondly, we can discover ways of talking about them. Mm-hmm. In a sense, that's what art is all about, is new ways of approaching experience and talking about experience and demonstrating experience. And we're getting better and better at that. And this becomes complicated because this is all very cultural.
Yes.
And we would, I don't know whether people really believe this, but there's some idea that in ancient Greece, there was a big switch between the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this was to do with the way they thought. So there's an earlier stage where introspection consisted of hearing the gods telling you what to do. And it's only later on that this became awareness of this is what you wanted to do. So there was actually a fundamental change in how you understood yourself, which would obviously influence very much how you explained your behavior to other people. So and you have this with children, for example, when my grandson hits his twin sister, he says, that was a mistake, I didn't intend to do it. Whereas presumably an ancient Greek child would have said, Zeus told me to, or something. So there are these very interesting cultural changes, which mean, although our brains are essentially the same as they were, whether it was 100, I can't remember this numbers, 100,000 years ago, the way we use them and the way we talk to each other are dramatically different. And that's because of consciousness. Yeah.
What do you think are the differences between the self and consciousness? Or do you think that it is just one thing? Self-consciousness is just its own thing?
No, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think the self is a very important aspect of consciousness, but there are things that I am aware of that are not just about me, I hope. Yeah. And certainly when we are interacting with other people, we become aware of what they are like. So I think there's more to I think the self is an important aspect of consciousness, but it's not the whole of consciousness.
Do you think it's just a model we've built? Do you think?
Yes, I think yes, this is getting back round slowly to the Bayesian idea. Yes, there are all these models. And we have a model of ourselves, which is very much determined, in fact, by other people. Mm-hmm. So my model of myself is probably largely what I think other people think of me.
With this Bayesian idea, I know that when you look at, let's say, for example, schizophrenia, it shows such a wide variety of experience, of conscious experience. You can see it as sort of a spectrum. I know Fletcher also does work on this, where he shows you how inherently all perception can be seen as hallucination, or all belief can be seen as delusion. And it's based on these prior expectations and how we experience that. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, because clearly then everything is technically hallucinatory or delusional.
Well, yes, it's partly a matter of how you use the words, but this goes back along at least to Helmholtz, is the idea that perception is not like being a camera. It's not the world coming into my eye and then I somehow make sense of it. I can only make sense of it if I have some prior expectation of what is out there. And these are what Bayesians call the priors, but it's really past experience, prior expectations. An example of this is that story, I think it's maybe from India, I'm not sure. It's about the 5 blind men who come across an elephant.
I'm not sure.
And one of them feels its trunk and says, this is a snake. And then another one feels its leg and says, this is a tree. And another one feels its tail and says, this is a lion or something.
Like that.
So and in every case, they're using their past experience of what this ought to be, given what I'm experiencing now.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's similar to the whole bunny duck situation. If you've grown up in a place where you've never really seen it, that rabbit duck illusion, where it's from one view to duck. If you grew up in a place where you've never seen a rabbit before, you're automatically going to see the duck.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And there's this very strong illusion, which you must know about, the inverse mask illusion.
Yes.
So if you have a mask of a face and you see it from the inside, where it's effectively an inside-out face, you cannot see it as an inside-out face, because inside-out faces don't exist. So yes, that's an example of the prior experience taking over. And there's lots of data supporting this idea, I think. I mean, basically our sensations are extremely crude and minimal. I mean, vision, we have this, we don't realize this, but there's a very small area in the middle of our field of view where we see things in detail, and beyond that is all blurred, but we're not aware of that, and we fill things in. And there's the famous example of the, what's it called, the blind spot. Mm-hmm. So there's this bizarre situation that the retina is the wrong way around, so the blood vessels are in front of the receptors, and then they all have to go through a small hole to get back to the rest of the body. But we're not aware of this hole. We fill it in on the basis of what's immediately around it. Mm. And you can fool the system to fill it in wrong and so on like that.
And yet, with that blind spot, even if you do, because there's that experiment, I mean, you close an eye and you slowly move your thumb away, and then suddenly your thumb disappears. And yet still, we know it's there, and yet your brain, it's gone.
Yes.
Can't help.
Yeah. And there are many, many optical illusions like that. I mean, there's the Muller-Lyer illusion where you see these two lines of different lengths,
yes,
even though you know they're not different lengths.
With the arrows and the edges, one's
that's right.
Closed.
Yeah. And the Necker cube, where because it's in 2 dimensions, it can have in 3 dimensions, it has 2 possible versions, and you just switch between them.
But then how do we trust our beliefs and our perceptions, Chris? How do we, as scientists, as people trying to figure out this neural basis, how can we trust anything we see?
Well, I mean, I think I would say one version of it, which is what Anil Seth took up, I think, is that our perception is a hallucination constrained by reality, which I also said in my book. And as long as the constraints are good enough, we're fine. I mean, that's the sense that we have a model of the world. What we perceive is our model of the world, not the world. Mm-hmm. And as long as our model is good enough for what we're trying to do, that is sufficient. Mm-hmm. And science operates the same way. So Newton had a model of how the world worked, which works incredibly well. And then Einstein came along and showed that some little bits at the edge of this model didn't actually work and produced general relativity or whatever it was.
It was like Mercury. It was like one of the few things that Newton's theory just couldn't solve.
Exactly. Right. And I think our perception is very much the same. It works most of the time. And occasionally with these optical illusions, you find where it's gone wrong. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we can now understand them. And what I mean, of course, my being so interested in the social aspect is that, say, we have our own model of the world, and not only can we test it by seeing what happens, making predictions and so on, but we can also test it by comparing it with other people's models. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a nice cartoon I found somewhere, which says that reality is a shared hallucination.
Pretty much.
And that's interesting because, in a sense, what goes wrong perhaps in schizophrenia is they stop sharing.
Mm.
And then they can go off in these weird directions because they're no longer constrained by how other people see things.
Yes, Anil says
that's a very speculative idea.
Yeah. But so in other words, we're all having these hallucinations, and the only reason why they work is because we're all sharing the same hallucination. And it's once someone diverges on the spectrum that they're no longer in touch with reality. And that's what obviously something like schizophrenia or psychosis is.
Yeah. And occasionally we discover that we're not sharing it. So, for example, people who are colorblind often don't discover that they're colorblind until they're adults. So a friend of ours didn't discover he was colorblind until he was a doctor, and they complained that he was filling in the forms wrong, and that's because he didn't realize they were different colors for different things. And perhaps the most famous example of this is the dress.
Yes.
Where suddenly people realize that some were seeing it this way and other people were seeing it other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the blue and black and white and gold.
Yeah.
And it turned out that blue and black because they then went into Photoshop, right-clicked on it, checked exactly what color it was, and the dress is actually blue and black. When I tell some of my friends that, they still think I'm lying to them, and this is not a true story, and yet that we perceived it differently.
But one theory is, I'm sure you know this, is to do with, of course, our perception of color is very depends on what we think is illuminating the scene.
Mm.
And one theory about the dress is that if you think it's being illuminated in daylight, it looks one color. If you think it's being illuminated in artificial light, it's another color. Yeah. So, I mean, and again, this is that's nice for me because, of course, that's the prior. Your prior is what you think it's been illuminating in, which you have to take into account to actually work out what the colors really are. Yeah.
Basically like the checkerboard illusion where you see the shadow and the two grays.
Oh, yes, and they look completely different.
Yeah. Automatically think it's a different color.
Yeah.
And yet still people tend to think that we're lying to them when you show them that this is actually the same color. You have to legitimately prove it to them.
Yeah.
But then, what then do you think about a fixed, firm belief? Because that's obviously what some of us have, and then there's this cognitive dissonance when you show them that our perceptions are not really always that accurate.
Oh, right. Well, that's it. I mean, if I would follow Carl Friston here and say there's a sort of hierarchy, and at the bottom of the hierarchy you have, what is the real color of this square? And you have priors and about what is being illuminated, and you could be persuaded that actually it's a different kind of illumination. But at the top of the hierarchy, you have belief like perception is accurate. And that could be very firmly fixed. And in the sense in schizophrenia, I think you have something eventually goes wrong at the top. So the idea that everybody is trying to deceive me becomes this high level prior that cannot really be changed, and it's very difficult to come up with evidence against that idea that everybody is trying to deceive you, because of course you're one of the people who's trying to deceive them anyway. So that,
And it's funny because in those schizophrenic patients, some of the psychotic patients, these perceptual illusions don't work on them.
Yes, that's right.
Actually, as it is, which shows that their priors have changed or from ours.
But that's very confusing, and I think that's more research is needed, as they say, because in some cases their priors are too strong, in other cases their priors are too weak. So there has to be some solution to this observation has to be made.
So Chris, tell me, what do you think then about, because part of when I worked, we did the philosophy and ethics of mental health, you see how we've had 3 biological sort of revolutions in psychiatry, for example. When Prozac was invented, that was one of them, and people went crazy. This was the new craze. And today it's functional MRIs, better neuroimaging. When is psychiatry going to actually get a hold of the field? that they that, that they really want to do. You know, is this going to happen in your opinion, or do you think we're going to continuously fail at this? Because
Well, no, I think it's like what I was saying earlier. I think, and for example, there's these very rare, I can't remember, what is it, 1% of people who get a diagnosis of schizophrenia actually have an autoimmune disease.
okay, I didn't know that.
There's a book, there's a journalist who this happened to, and she describes it very well. And I think what will happen is that there are multiple causes of schizophrenia and psychosis, and they will gradually be discovered, but not all of them. It's a bit like in the olden days, I think there used to be something called mental deficiency. And currently, every week, another 1% is explained by some unique genetic alteration, which is gradually explaining all these things. And I think something analogous might happen with schizophrenia. They'll be found, there'll be a genetic version, and there'll be an autoimmune version, and there'll be various other versions. And each time that will then become part of neurology, and what's left will be unexplained and left to the psychiatrists. So somehow.
I once tried to figure out the sort of evolutionary basis for psychosis and schizophrenia, and I remember I think I was reading something in Evolutionary Psychiatry. It was a journal, I can't remember the name, but they were talking about how a lot of foreigners, people who move from one country to another, tend to develop schizophrenia at a higher rate than those who stay in their own place. And if you have to think about the evolutionary advantage of that, it would be trust people around you a little less because you don't know them and they might not have your best interests at heart. So it's fascinating to think that there might be a lot of evolutionary basis behind some of these mental illnesses.
That's right. I mean, I'm very interested in this, going back to the Bayesian story. There's this idea of volatility. So so this is a new way of looking at learning. So you can have fast learning, you can have slow learning. And normally we think of slow learning as surely bad, but it entirely depends on the environment you're in. So if you're in a stable environment, then it pays to learn slowly because what you've learned in the past probably still applies, so you don't need to change very much. But if you're in a volatile environment, you have to learn quickly because the situation keeps changing. And I guess if you move to a foreign country, you're precisely in a more volatile environment. And it's interesting that this does seem to have an effect on the dopamine system. So that, I think as you increase the amount of dopamine, the learning rate will increase, so you're learning faster, which is good for a volatile environment. And of course, if you have a higher level prior that says I'm in a volatile environment when you're not, this could produce all sorts of peculiarities.
While we're on neuroanatomy, I mean, when you talk about how we might have emerged or evolved consciousness, I mean, which parts of the brain do you think are most responsible for this?
This is very controversial, as you probably know. I think there are two aspects to this. I think, first of all, I think it's pretty well agreed that consciousness requires long-range connectivity between different brain regions. And if this breaks down, you become unconscious. Now, certainly in the case of self-conscious or meta-consciousness, I think the frontal cortex is critical because in a sense it's at the top of this hierarchy, which is where, though we don't know much about it yet, where you're modeling how the rest of the brain works. And I think that's necessary for this, this high level of consciousness, for sentience, which is what I like to call this lower level of consciousness, which we probably share with many, many animals. That probably doesn't involve the frontal cortex to the same degree and is probably much more dependent on the long-range connectivity. So one of the things, if we think about sentience, for example, one of the things that has fascinated me for a long time is, what's it called? Corollary discharge and reafference principle. So when we move, and again, Helmholtz was involved in this as part of the reason. When we move our eyes, obviously the image on our retina is jumping about all over the place, but we don't see the world jumping about, we perceive it as stable. And this goes right back to the very beginning of evolution, when organisms were able for the first time to move under their own power. Almost immediately there had to be a mechanism which enabled them to recognize the difference between movement out there due to something else moving and movement out there due to them moving. And this is where the reafference or corollary discharge comes in, because you basically, when you move yourself, you have to send a signal to the receptive parts of the brain to say, this is not the world moving, this is me moving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's perhaps that sort of interaction between brain areas is the start of something like sentience. And if that's the case, it's certainly present in fish and insects and all sorts of much lower organisms than us.
I was speaking to Ian McGilchrist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. We were speaking just the other day, and we're talking about like Gazzaniga's work, for example, his work, how important a corpus callosum is in terms of that long range connection you're talking about. I mean, because you split that and a lot can happen. Well, what comes to your mind when you think about split brain patients? How does it affect anything in terms of your view of consciousness?
Well, I'm a little bit dubious about this. I mean, one problem is that they don't do the operation anymore, so we can't sort of replicate the results. The other problem is that occasionally people turn up who never had a corpus callosum, and they seem to be remarkably normal compared to the late cases where they are split. So, I mean, clearly, so I guess I'm not really sure what I would predict ought to happen. I mean, a lot of the brain imaging work, in a sense, went against this idea of distinct properties for the left and the right brain. So, for example, language was always used to be very much in the left brain, but the brain imaging showed there's all sorts of aspects of language that are in the right brain as well. There's this interesting phenomenon of left-sided neglect, where there does seem to be some laterality to attention, so that one side of the brain seems to attend to both fields and the other side to only one, which is slightly odd. So I'm very confused about the role of laterality.
That in terms of that it's sort of a hemispatial neglect. Professor Michael Graziano at Princeton, he has attention schema theory. So he sort of says that it's more about what we're attending to, and then we build models to tell us what we're attending to, and that's what we sort of call consciousness.
Yes,
it's more of a caricature. We're not really seeing reality as it is. We're just caricaturing everything we see.
Yes, I mean, that's another version of what we were talking about earlier. We have a model of the world, and that's what we see, not the world itself. But I think, yes, his ideas are very interesting in relation to how attention works, and particularly the idea that once we can model our own attention, we can perhaps model other people's attention. And I would even go as far as to say maybe it's the other way around, that we start off by having to note, it's very important to us to work out where other people are attending to. I mean, this is not just for us. I mean, there's all this nice work with Tomasello on chimpanzees. So the low-ranking chimpanzee has to make sure the high-ranking chimpanzee can't see the food, so that they can then go and get it. So knowing where other people are attending to is very important. And maybe once we have worked out how to do that, we suddenly realize we can apply it to ourselves. And there's a similar version in relation to theory of mind. So the sort of standard idea was we first of all learn how to think about our own minds, our intentions, our beliefs and desires, and then we apply it to other people. But some people have suggested it's actually the other way around. We find it so useful to work out what other people are wanting and knowing and desiring that there's a pressure to find that out, and then we find we can apply it to ourselves as well.
Fascinating. So what I'm going to do is, Chris, so the podcast is obviously called Mind Body Solutions. So we're trying to figure out the answer to the infamous mind-body problem. So I'm going to run through a couple of theories with you, or a couple of philosophical views, and I just want to hear your thoughts on them. Let's start off with panpsychism. What are your thoughts on panpsychism?
Yes, I don't really understand this. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I think consciousness is a biological thing, so I expect to find it in biological entities or machines that are built to represent or to copies of biological entities. So it could be in silicon. And I don't really, I mean, the philosophers say that this doesn't solve the hard problem of how you get subjective experience out of a physical entity. And I guess I would say I don't really worry about that at this stage, but the idea that spoons are conscious in some sense doesn't really help me with what I'm trying to do.
Do you think it's a problem with semantics here? We're just all just saying the same word in a very different way?
I think that's partly it, yes. I mean, it depends what, I mean, does it make any sense to say that spoons are having subjective experience?
But if you then think about something like IIT, integrated information theory, do you think that's following a similar path, or because they're also trying to search for a neural basis of consciousness, of course?
Yes, I mean, I mean, they're clearly searching for a neural basis of consciousness, and I think I would agree that long-range connectivity in the brain is very important. What I don't quite get with integrated information theory is that they start from I can't remember 5 principles of what consciousness is, and I don't agree with them. I can't at this moment, I mean, because I don't agree with them, of course, I can't remember what they are. But I think, for example, that it's integrated, and for example, Semir Zeki was always saying that consciousness wasn't integrated at all, and it was very messy and so on. And so I think their starting point of what consciousness is not the same as mine.
Do you think global workspace theory does a better job at explaining it?
Yes, I think that's one of the best ones around at the moment.
Why do you think that?
Why do I? Oh, well, I mean, lots of, partly because Stan Nahan's a friend of mine, but I think, but I think it fits the data very well. In my paper, I point that out, so that but if you think it's to do with it goes back to the idea of working memory. Working memory very much involves parietal and frontal cortex. You find that parietal and frontal cortex are the bits of the brain that are less active and disconnected in coma and vegetative state and things like that. In the experiments I actually did when I was still doing brain imaging, where we were looking at the difference between things that you were conscious of and things that were affecting the brain that you were not conscious of. When you were not conscious of a face, for example, the face area lit up. But when you were conscious of that face, then parietal and frontal cortex lit up as well. So that sort of fits with this sort of story. I guess my worry about global workspace theory is that I don't really quite understand the ignition story. And of course, it doesn't bring in other people, and how reporting works and all that sort of thing. But I think it's the best one around at the moment. Though I also like, of course, Hak-Wen Lau and David Rosenthal's higher order thought theory. But
can you give me some reasons for that one as well?
Well, that one, I think, that may be talking about a different thing. So I think higher order thought theory, is actually talking about this meta-consciousness, which is this higher level where you're aware that you're aware. And there's lots of evidence that, for example, we talk about explicit metacognition. which metacognition means thinking about thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm particularly interested in our ability, when we make decisions, we can actually think about how likely is this decision to be right? How much confidence do I have in this decision? And we have this feeling of confidence. We can actually describe how confident we are to other people. This is actually useful in when we work with other people, sort of to compare our levels of confidence. And again, there's lots of brain imaging work, particularly from Stephen Fleming, showing that when people have to use confidence, they're actually using a particular part of the frontal cortex, that is the frontal polar area, BA10, which seems to have a special role in thinking about thinking. And it seems to me thinking about thinking is very closely related to this higher order thought theory of consciousness. So so I like that idea, yeah.
Yeah, I think it seems like a lot of these theories have so many good ideas that somehow just going to accumulate and provide us with one at some point. It's almost like they all kind of need each other a little bit.
Yes, I think that's right.
All the good points.
And there, of course, there's an interesting paper recently which looked at all these different theories of consciousness and the way that they test themselves. I mean, the experiments they do to test them, which quite nicely showed, as you might expect, that they test their own theory, but it has no impact whatever on any of the other theories. So that the test that you use for global workspace theory is jolly good for global workspace theory, but it has no relevance for IIT or higher order thought. So in a sense, they have to somehow come together, which is beginning to happen.
I remember when I was chatting to Michael Graziano, he was telling me how he can take attention schema theory and actually plunk it onto global workspace theory, and then you have a much better theory of consciousness as a whole. Because he believes that global workspace theory is one of the better ones in terms of explaining this.
No, I think that's right. But I'm reminded, I don't know whether you read these novels by Sebastian Faulks.
I haven't.
But one of them, I can't remember what it was called, but it's a series of 5 different stories. And one of them is about this neuroscientist in Italy who discovers the neural basis of consciousness. And I was involved because he asked me to comment on this before, whether it was plausible and so on. And the hippocampus had a major role. But what I found quite nice about this story was that when she does define, in the story, she finds the neural basis of consciousness and everybody agrees it's the neural basis of consciousness, and then everybody loses interest.
This podcast becomes completely irrelevant. Let's hope no one figures it out at any point. That's exactly what happened with the Jan Vittel. I mean, going back to what we were talking about earlier. Once it's done, once we figure it out, it's like magic.
Yes, yeah.
Nicholas Humphrey and I were chatting about it. Because he calls it phenomenal surrealism.
Right.
No longer considers it an illusion. He thinks it's more real than real, like even redder than red, because we perceive it as red. But yeah, he sees it as magic.
No, I think that's a good point. Actually, it is, yes, consciousness is more real than real. Yeah.
So yeah, I think he called it. I think his paper is redder than red. I can't remember exactly the name. Yes, but just on the same topic though. Once the magician tells you the trick, I mean, you're done. The search is over. Exactly. You're over this whole magical experience. It's finished.
Yes, I think so. Some people, I won't name names, like to keep their theories has a little bit of magic. It has a little bit that no one can quite understand.
Do you think when people make these definitions, let's say, like when we claim that it's a hard problem of consciousness, that we're adding like the element that we don't need? I mean, Daniel Dennett is trying to quining qualia away to make it easier for us to actually find a neural basis of consciousness. Do you think that's a better approach? Not necessarily to make it an illusion, but to at least make.
I think it is a better approach. Yes, I mean the other extreme is it McGinn? Is it the people who call themselves mysterions who say we won't be able to solve it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I think that's clearly what's the word? A challenge. If you say it's impossible to solve, then right, we're going to do it then. Yeah.
You think this is a way for philosophers just to keep their jobs in certain?
Yeah.
tell me, Chris, when it comes to theory of mind, I mean, you
Yeah.
and Mark, you've done such great work in terms of working together, humans, why we're meant to work together. Um, over over time, how do you think that this has led to such crazy amounts of technological revolutions? I mean, in terms of what we've done as a species, why do you think humans have done so much more than, let's say, our cousins, chimpanzees, bonobos, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I think, yes, I think the basic reason is that, as we were saying earlier, that we are able actually to share our subjective experiences. We can, as a result of this, we can actually alter our subjective experiences and make them, in some sense, more accurate, better models
Mm-hmm.
of what the world is like. Because we can talk to each other about what world is like, and we can get better theories. I mean, this is what science is all about. You have a better and better model of the world. It's never gets there, but it gets better each time. And we can, I mean, there's this lovely book by Celia Hayes, which is all about cognitive gadgets, which is about has given us new ways of thinking. So, and these maybe are more important than these cognitive tools, may be more important than, say, stone tools or iron tools or whatever. I mean, mathematics is an example of a tool which has been created by humans interacting together. So, I mean, and writing is another example. So, I mean, universal literacy has only been around for the last 100 years or so. I mean, so these are the things that have made us, given us all these advantages, which means that we're now dominating the world and probably about to destroy it. But that's another matter.
Like on a
And the other thing is very frightening. It could all be lost.
exactly. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I often ask this. I mean, I don't believe there is any sort of teleology. I'm very agnostic regarding anything regarding the origins of the universe or why we're here, what we're here to do. But do you think, for example, AI would be the next evolutionary step? And do you think it's meant to be? Do you think that's what humans are actually here to do, in a sense?
Well, in some sense, yes. I mean, yes, we wouldn't want to say it was meant to happen,
Yes.
but we would say the way the system works means it will happen.
Mm. It's the next logical step. But that's obviously
Yeah,
something that will survive. Let's say something a bit more catastrophic on the planet.
yeah,
Should we send it into space or
yeah.
do whatever with it?
I mean, that's very interesting, and I'm sad that I probably won't live to see this happening. But I'm certainly very interested in, yes, what's happening in AI and deep mind and all this sort of thing.
Sort of quantum computing. I mean, they're doing a lot of intriguing stuff, but I also don't think I'll
Yeah,
be alive, to be honest. But then
yeah.
again, I still don't think most of us would be alive at that point. Things are going down south very quickly.
But I think even deep mind, the amazing things they're doing is all happening at this lowest level from a biological point of view. I mean, in my paper, I show this diagram of 3 levels, and at the bottom level, we have model-free learning, as it's called, which depends on having huge amounts of evidence and doing statistical learning. And I think that's what AI can do at the moment. And it has to.
Sorry, sorry, continue, Chris. What were you saying?
I was just going to say the next step up is to start making models, and they're beginning to do that, but I'm not sure whether that's how far that's got yet.
Yeah. Michael was telling me that they are applying their theory to certain AI, and it's starting to work quite well. I mean,
Yeah,
they're making some progress, but they're just very far away
yeah,
to
yeah.
with obviously to the complexity that we've reached over billions of years. It takes a long time, but I
Yeah.
think we'll get there. I don't know. It's
I
something.
mean, certainly in relation to theory of mind, there are, I mean, my worries about our ideas about how theory of mind works is we don't really have a good computational account of how that works. And people are beginning to develop it, like, what's his name, Tenenbaum and Griffiths. But I think it's not quite there yet. And they typically say, yes, we've solved this, but I say, well, that's not what I meant by theory of mind. Yeah.
Do you feel that, I mean, we're obviously following this computational approach right now, but it's because this is the current framework we live in. I mean, people often have this argument that when we understood the way pumps work, that's how we thought the brain worked. When the train station, we thought it works the same way,
Yeah.
mechanistic. Do you feel that perhaps there might be something we'll figure out in the future that will go beyond this computational model, or you think we got it this time, that we're almost there?
Um, no, I'm thinking there will certainly be better things. I guess that's a very interesting point, because that's absolutely right. I mean, what was wrong with Freud's approach? Because he started off by having this model of the mind that it was basically hydraulic, and he didn't know about information flow and such like. So I think that was a big step forward, is to go. So he was just talking about energy,
Mm.
and the switch to be able to talk about information, I think, was a crucial step in this direction. And there may well be another crucial step, but of course, because we haven't made it yet, we have absolutely no idea
Mm.
what it is. But in some sense, I mean, this is a sort of Turing story, that you can model anything on a general computer.
Mm-hmm.
So you could model your hydraulic system, you could model your steam engine type system. What we don't know is what we should be modeling, I guess. But I mean, I agree entirely that we're always using the technology we currently have.
Mm.
But I think we're beginning to get a sort of meta technology.
Mm.
So we have a technology of technology, which may be the critical step to
What
the next
are your thoughts,
stage.
Chris, on idealism?
Idealism, well, that is, I guess I'm not quite sure what that means. Do you mean in the sort of Platonic sense?
So basically, that it's all mind, because there's a lot of theories now. I mean, for example, Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup. There's a lot of people who are saying that it's all in the mind. Everything is mind, and
Right, yeah.
making some very good physical theories, like physics, using a lot of physics to actually prove that space-time, for example, isn't as real as we thought it was, according to the mathematics, and then trying to figure out how consciousness could be fundamental to that.
Yes, I haven't really thought about that. Is this a bit solipsistic in the sense that, say, we are creating the world out there? I think, yes, I'm not so happy with that. I mean, at least I am very keen to believe that there is a real world out there that we're trying to find out about. But I agree that the way what we impose upon it is obviously must be, to some extent, created by our minds. I mean, this is almost a sort of Bayesian thing, that the priors come from within. So in that sense,
A sort of naive realism. It's we know that there's something there, but we're just not seeing it as accurately as we
yeah,
would like.
yes, I'm a naive realist, I think. So I think, yes, we're getting more accurate. But I believe that there is, I mean, if we don't believe there's anything out there, there's no way we can improve our accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be something. I mean, I'm very keen on prediction errors.
Yes.
I mean, that's a sort of Bayesian story. Errors are a jolly good thing, because they tell us about what we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So I'm keen on the idea that there are things that we don't know that we will be able to find out a bit about.
Mm. Tell me, Chris, when you started out with this, because there's a book by John Horgan, or is it Horgan or Hagen, called Mind Body Problems.
Right.
And what the author does is look at different scientists, philosophers, Christoph Koch, for example, each one, and it almost goes into a personal deep dive into their life and how their
Right.
personal experiences might have led them to their current belief in consciousness. So, for example, if someone was very spiritual or very religious, somehow thinks consciousness will be fundamental. Someone who's not, who grows up very atheist, tends to think consciousness is an illusion. So, how do you think your spiritual views and beliefs have shaped the way you think about consciousness today?
Well, I was certainly brought up in a very religious family, Anglican, of course. But I sort of dropped it. I mean, and I still get a great deal of pleasure from services and singing psalms and peculiar rituals of this sort. So I quite like to be an Anglican on the grounds that these are the Christians who don't actually believe in God. So that's So from that, I mean, so there's that side of it. I guess my main interest in consciousness probably was because I very early on trained as a clinical psychologist, and I actually interacted with people with psychosis who had hallucinations and delusions, and I became completely fascinated by what on earth a hallucination, what it meant to be having a hallucination. And of course, I was also reading Philip K. Dick, which is a very strong experience.
Yeah.
And his theme, of course, is that, reality is not what we think it is. And what we are being, it's an illusion that's been created by evil capitalists of some kind to keep us down. So, I mean, so those two sides may be extremely interested in hallucinations. Why should my beliefs about the world be any better than these patients that I was interacting with? And I guess that was my start in thinking about. So I was thinking about hallucinations, and I realized very rapidly that this is actually all about consciousness. So a hallucination is the extreme subjective experience, because it doesn't actually, it's not based on what's coming into the senses. So it's almost subjective experience without reality. So that was, and I guess that was my main starting point.
And then at some point, I mean, in your book, Making Up the Mind, I mean, I remember reading it a long time ago for the first time, and I mean, it blew my mind as well. I mean, you talk about various different things in your papers, in your books. Altered states of consciousness are one of them. How do you think altered states of consciousness give us a better understanding of consciousness in itself?
Well, there's some very interesting, I mean, I talk about this a bit in my paper, but I think the altered states of consciousness make us realize that, there's more to it than we typically experience. I mean, that certainly it's a very basis for studying levels of consciousness when you're talking about altered states due to lack of various things. But also the use of psychedelic drugs reveal that you can have states of consciousness that are not like what we are used to. And again, I think that's very important. It's rather like the dress, to realize that there's more to consciousness than perhaps we realize. I'm not quite sure in what direction this is going to go in, but one of the things it may be important is going right back to how we started talking about how do you study subjective experience. And there is always this problem with psychology that introspection is difficult. And we need better tools for doing introspection. And I think studying altered states is one of the ways of improving the tools, because it, in a sense, defines different dimensions within which we might describe our conscious experience. So it's giving us a better sort of framework for beginning to talk about our subjective experience, which is what we desperately need. So that's.
And there are a lot of universities nowadays studying like the effects of psilocybin, LSD, certain drugs on patients with depression, etc. And it seems to be very promising.
Yes, I'm still a little bit suspicious, but it's certainly worth looking at further.
I think the one I read, I remember there was a 5 or 6 month follow-up on patients who had taken a high dose psilocybin trip. It was 4 grams, a very high dose, and most of the patients' experiences seem to be they're back to normal at their baseline, which obviously needs to still be peer reviewed a lot more and tested. But that does seem to be quite promising, because currently, if you look at our current approach to treating depression, I mean, antidepressants are not up to standard. It's really disappointing actually how effective they are.
Well, no, that's a big problem. I mean, also in the study of psychosis, because basically Big Pharma has stopped doing any research because there's no obvious direction to take. So we certainly need to somehow get back into that, although I'm not quite sure where that would take us. But no, I think this is interesting. But as I say, bigger trials are needed. And there's also the work on ketamine.
Sorry?
Which is
yes,
ketamine. Yeah.
Yes, there's been a lot of studies on that as well.
Yeah.
I think it's Joanna Moncrief who wrote a book on um, big pharma and how a lot of these drugs are just completely controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, and it's taken over. It's taken a life on its own. That the way the science no longer really matters at this point.
Yeah.
Do you feel the same way as a clinical psychologist that look in psychiatry? I mean, these patients are all no longer sorting out the psychological elements and the social elements.
Well, I mean, it's partly to do with the matter of expense, but I mean, the drugs, they're still giving the same drugs that were discovered basically in the 50s.
Hmm.
And as I said, the pharmaceuticals companies are no longer interested in trying to develop better drugs because they don't know how to. There's a lot of work with what's it called, cognitive behavior therapy, although this is not quite as good as we were hoping. Sorry, it was something else I was going to say, but it's partly. And when I was studying schizophrenia long ago, there were these huge mental hospitals which were full of patients, and they were all closed down. And it was believed that this would help them and they would no longer be institutionalized. Now, this has not worked. It was effectively a money-saving enterprise. And they're now treated in the community, which is a euphemism for not being treated at all. This is, and I'm sure that much better procedures could be applied if there was the money to do so. But we still don't, I mean, but this is not about cure, this is about management.
No, true.
And apart from these odd things like the very rare cases that have autoimmune problems which can actually be cured, the rest of it we still don't know.
When you look at autistic patients, I mean, minds are clearly better than one. I mean, you and your wife, you speak about this. You've got a graphic novel. You've done a lot of lectures on it. How do you think that patients on the autistic spectrum differ from the average person in terms of how they perceive the world from a theory of mind perspective?
Well, certainly at the more extreme ends of the spectrum, I think they genuinely have difficulty in recognizing that behavior is driven by beliefs rather than reality. And therefore, the difficulty in understanding that people can have false beliefs, difficulty in understanding that people can, I mean, this is the dangerous part, people can be deliberately deceiving you by trying to impart a false belief in you. So they can be over-trusting.
Yes.
So there are these sorts of problems. The other area where they may have difficulty is recognizing, which is a part of the same thing, things like white lies, that you can deceive people for good reasons. And you don't always have to obey the rules, so they tend to be very rule-bound because of not recognizing these sort of gray areas, which can make them difficult to work with because they object to people doing minor infringements, which I'm sure our Prime Minister suffers from. Anyway,
I think that's one of the things that I do like most about the Bayesian brain approach is that you try and explain this with using Bayes' theorem and using these priors. I mean, it does explain quite a lot of psychiatric disorders. I mean, too many incorrect priors, fixed false.
Yes, I think the danger is it maybe explains too much. And I mean, I think it can explain things on a low level, but we need much more testable predictions. So it's perhaps too good at explaining things, but we need to actually have some new hypotheses that we can demonstrate.
And so we've spoken about panpsychism, idealism, so people just thinking all in the mind. What about those who believe in quantum consciousness? I mean, this is in the microtubules. You've got Hameroff, Penrose. This is something more.
I don't think we need it. I mean, I think the microtubules is largely discounted as far as I understand it, but I'm not convinced that we need a special, I mean, as yet, we don't need to bring in these rather abstruse physical mechanisms to explain how the brain works. I had once had an interaction with Penfield about, and one of his arguments is that the brain cannot be a computer because, you know, people can solve non-computable problems or something. I can't remember the details. And I was objecting to this because I was saying, well, in fact, when you look at the computation involved, at an unconscious level, we do actually much better than we do at the conscious level. Our conscious processing is actually much more primitive than the unconscious processing. So if we really need quantum type explanations, it may apply at the unconscious level of how well the brain works, but we don't really need it for the conscious level. It seems to me that's a different problem.
In a few weeks, I'm chatting to Mark Solms. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. Mark Solms.
Oh yes, psychoanalysis. Yes.
Yes. So he sort of thinks it's a bit more primitive, a lot more primitive, actually. That it's not actually so much to do with the prefrontal cortex and that sort of communication out downward. It's more from the bottom up where consciousness sort of evolves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I think that goes back to this idea that the frontal cortex is particularly involved with self-consciousness and meta-consciousness, and that sentience may well be much more bottom-up. I'm not myself too keen on psychoanalytic approaches to this because I don't quite know how they fit or what it's all about. But I would certainly agree that there's a lot of, the bottom end of sentience, which, as I say, is probably shared with fish and bumblebees and so on. The frontal cortex may not be so relevant, and this is certainly, in that sense, very primitive.
When you think of other species like, let's say, dolphins, what else? Let's just octopi. I mean, is it octopuses or octopi?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the correct term there is, but a lot of people have done studies now with octopuses, and they seem to think that they're a lot more complicated than we thought.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, one task, which there's this chap, Jonathan Birch, who's written a great deal about consciousness. He's a philosopher about invertebrate consciousness, and I think makes a very good case for octopuses, which I think, anyway, to the extent that it's now, I think the government has recognized that octopuses and squids should be protected in certain ways. But there's a very interesting task, which I talk about in my paper, which is this reversal learning. You know about this? So it's a very simple task. For example, you can have two food wells, which have, one's red and one's blue, and food is hidden under one of them. And most creatures can learn with trial and error that it's hidden under the red one. And so they do that for some time, and then you switch, without telling them, you switch the reward to the blue one. And then after a few trials, they realize they were wrong, and they realize it's now under the blue one, and you can go on doing this. This is very boring. And a very simple model-free learning device can learn this, but every time you switch, it takes a certain number of trials until it gets the right answer. But most creatures show something which is called learning to learn. So after a few switches, they can switch much more quickly. And this involves actually a higher level. You now have to go up to a level which recognizes that the world has two states. It's either the red's good or the blue's good. And you have to recognize when the state changes. And this is also very interesting from a Bayesian point of view, because when it's this is all probabilistic. So even when it's usually under the red one, it's only under the red one, say 80% of the time. So very occasionally you'll find it's under the other one. You'll be wrong. But because you realize it's a state, you say, this, I know this is just noise, so I ignore these prediction errors. This is becoming very sophisticated. You say prediction errors are not always important. Mm-hmm. In some situations, I ignore them. But you've also learned that after a certain amount of time, it's going to switch. And therefore you start saying, well, I'm reaching the point where I suspect that these prediction errors are becoming important, because they may be telling me there's going to be a switch in the state of the world, so I'll start attending to them. And that's how you can switch very rapidly, because you roughly know when it's going to be. And as soon as there's a prediction error at this point, then you say, I'm going to switch to the other one. Mm-hmm. So this is highly sophisticated and enables you to switch quickly. Now, what is interesting is that most creatures can do this. This is what Jonathan Birch points out, that this rapid learning to learn, this reversal learning switch can be found in many animals, goldfish, probably, I think they haven't done bumblebees yet, but they probably will. And I think this is a marker of sentience. You now have a model of the world that it can be in two different states, rather than just learning this response is good or this response is good. That's the difference between the model-free learner who just knows whether the response is good or not and has to unlearn it, and the model-determined learner who realizes there are two different states of the world and this is what I have to learn about. And I think that's where sentience is. And if this really is a marker of sentience, then many creatures have it.
That's quite interesting. So even goldfish are able to do this.
I think, yeah.
That's pretty cool. I want to see. That's fascinating. When you think about virtual realities, I mean, we're reaching a point where we're talking about things like meta and metaverse. People are talking about how we're all at some point going to be computerized. We're going to plug ourselves in, become part of a virtual world. What do you think that it's possible that this is actually a virtual? How do you ever have those sort of philosophical thoughts as a very prominent figure in the neuroscience and psychology field?
No, I have to say, I mean, I've certainly been interested in the idea of a brain in a vat. And this really goes right back to Descartes, who was worried about, there's an evil demon that's determining what I'm perceiving. And I guess, but I've never really taken that on board. And I guess it's to do with interacting with other people who have slightly different views of the world, who have have different past experiences. And it doesn't, if we were all brains in vats, I would have thought the similarity would be much greater. Or maybe, but it depends on how sophisticated the programmer is. But I think, so I'm not really taken with that. I'm certainly very interested in the idea that, with virtual reality, we do become brains in vats. But interestingly, we can choose which vat we're in, which is quite
exactly
interesting. But so far, I have not been very impressed with the virtual reality. I have tried, but I'm not very good at it. I mean, Uta was once asked to be on the jury of every year they have some competition for the best new game or something. And so we got lots of these games to play, and we found that we were completely incompetent at playing them. So that was probably the reason why I'm not impressed by the virtual worlds, because I'm just not very good at getting into them properly.
If you had an opportunity, Chris, to actually put your brain, download your consciousness and keep it alive and keep it going, would you do that?
That's a very interesting question. Probably not, unless the virtual worlds were much better than they are now. And I'm very mystified about this idea that we'll soon be able to download our brain into a computer or something, because it's becoming more and more complicated. I mean, the recent work says that you'd have to take into account, every synapse, not just every neuron.
Exactly.
And I think there's not enough.
And you lose a lot of competition in the sense that we are very much embodied beings functioning. I mean, a lot of our perceptual experiences come from the fact that we have
Yeah,
hands.
yeah,
I mean,
yes,
we count
exactly.
in tens because we've got these 10 fingers. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
so there's a lot that we'd lose out in terms of information.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, the other thing I've been very fascinated by is that people have started working on, occasionally people have 6 fingers instead of 5. And it's to some extent genetic. And I think there's a family in Brazil where they all have 6 fingers or something. And there's some very interesting work on what they do with their mobile phones. And they're actually able to do more things than.
It's quite cool. I'm going to read up on that after this.
And that's called augmented reality, I think. But I mean, we're going to get things, I mean, machines or whatever, extra bits so that we can actually have more fingers or more arms or whatever it is. So that would be quite, I mean, I guess I'm more interested in that aspect of interacting with reality than the virtual reality.
It's funny because now David Chalmers has completely left consciousness. Well, he hasn't left it, but he's now very much focused on virtual reality and the philosophy of virtual.
Yeah.
How do we behave? What are the moral? What are
Yeah.
the ethical principles here, etc.?
But I think that's interesting because I would be interested in what he thinks about, having more hands or. And there's also work on having new senses. So, for example, you can wear a belt through which you can feel where magnetic north is. Is that useful?
It's quite interesting because if you grow up learning how to use it, it definitely affects your priors.
Yeah. And that's again goes back to consciousness because our subjective experience depends a great deal on what sensory inputs we have. And presumably someone who is blind from birth has a very different conscious experience from other people. And likewise, if we can have these extra senses, what will that do to us? I mean, again, I'm jumping around a bit, but this recent discovery that some women have 4 color receptors rather than 3.
Yes.
Yeah. Does it make any difference?
Does it?
Can you make use of it? Yeah. So these are I guess I'm more interested in these developments.
David Eagleman does a lot of work on sensory substitution, and how you can wear a sort of vest that'll vibrate in a certain way if you are blind, and then you've got glasses on it, and it'll take in the information via a camera and then vibrate a certain way on your vest, and then you know what reality is. You paint a new picture for yourself. So
yes, exactly.
But then that leads to the question: how much more could we augment this real experience? I agree, which is a lot more intriguing to think about. Do you believe in free will, Chris?
Yes. I took a long time, but it's a very social thing. I think the experience of having free will is to some extent a social phenomenon. I mean, like I was talking about, the ancient Greeks perhaps didn't think they had free will because the gods were telling them what to do. But if you then attribute that to it's me telling myself what to do, then you do have free will. But I'm very interested there's this interesting relationship between free will and responsibility. And we're all brought up to feel responsible for our actions. And this is why I was said very early on, my grandson if he hits his twin sister, will say, I'm not responsible because it was an accident. So he's learned very early on to make the distinction between things you do deliberately and things that you do by accident. And this has become very important, at least in Western cultures, about, it's a basis of legal things. You have to have the intention to do something, that didn't just happen. And I think this is something we learn on very early on, and we have this feeling that we're responsible for our actions. We have particularly a strong feeling of regret. So, and the mere fact that we can feel regret that I should have done something else implies that at the time we could have done something else. Otherwise, this doesn't make any sense. So I think, again, the feeling of regret, the feeling of being in control of our actions, these are very important aspects of our conscious experience. And they are the basis of our belief in free will. And they're very important for social cohesion and the rule of law and understanding people, because we believe that people do things for reasons. And in that sense, we expect people to have, to some extent, free will. So I think that's very important. It's a cultural phenomena that to some extent is created by culture and is also very important for making culture work.
So even though like we have these experiments by Benjamin Libet, let's say, or Uri Miles does certain work on it as well, you still believe just because it's because of this fundamental link with moral responsibility that you have to take it into account.
And Patrick Haggard has followed up the Libet experiments in many studies. And what he has shown is that, and you know, the experience of action is just like other perceptions. It's very Bayesian. So you have a prior and you have an outcome. So your experience of performing an act is you have a prior intention and you have the outcome, and they're bound together to give the experience of the action. And I think what Libet, the reason that Libet finds that, you know, say when I had the decision to do the action is later, is because of this binding phenomena. And you can move it around. I mean, that's what Patrick Haggard has shown. You can move the timing around by what happens afterwards. So in a sense, what happens afterwards is bound into your subjective experience of the act. So I think the timing is not, the fact that it happens after the brain starts working is not relevant to the problem of whether we have free will or not. It's part of it's the way the experience is created.
To close, Chris, like there's listeners, they often love to, well, when some of their favorite neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers tell us some book recommendations or author recommendations in general, or your favorite philosophers. If you had to give me 5 at least, 5 books.
Give you 5.
Within the field, with two
I mean, relevant books. I mean, the book on consciousness that people should now read is Hakwon Lau's new book, In Consciousness We Trust. Is that, I think it's called that.
Who's it? Sorry, repeat the author's name.
Hakwon Lau.
I haven't read it.
Oh, L-A-U. I mean, he's worked with, yes, it's very new. It only came out a month ago. Okay. So that tells you a great, it's tough. It's not like Anil Seth. It's, he goes into the nitty gritty of how you do experiments and so on.
Okay, so like it's not like Being You. I think Anil's is Being You.
Yeah. I'm basically recommending all my friends. Nick Shea wrote a few years ago, and what's good about this Hakwon's book is, I think it's Oxford University Press, but it's free. You can download it for free.
Okay.
Nick Shea is a philosopher who wrote a couple of years ago a book about representation, which is very important in neuroscience. And I can't remember what it's called, but that's also, you can download it for free. Okay. Of course, the best philosophy book, if you're interested in Wittgenstein and people like that, is Logicomics. Have you know that one, which is the graphic novel on the life of Bertrand Russell. And obviously you have to read a Philip K. Dick book if you want to understand.
I've got a really cool Philip K. Dick box set from Folio.
Oh, right. Yeah. But yes, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is the sort of classic.
Yeah.
But there's another one which has the lovely title of The Penultimate Truth. Oh gosh, it's very difficult.
Stuff, I put you on the spot there. A lot of my guests they get caught on the spot at that moment when I ask them that question.
Yeah. But I'm not very good on books.
If you had to think about the philosophers or psychologists who really influenced your view and made you the person you are today in terms of the thinker you are, who do you think played some big roles?
Well, I mean, there's Tim Challis's book, which is called Neuropsychology and Mental Structure. I mean, that's quite an old book, but that was very influential on my work. And obviously I read all the old stuff like Donald Hebb's principle, what was it called? Principles of behavior?
I'm not sure.
No, yeah, sure. And going back even further, because I had to give the Bartlett lecture recently, I read Frederick Bartlett's book called Remembering, which is from 1932, but that has all this sort of Bayesian approach that memory is constructive and so on.
Okay.
And has a second section on social psychology, even, and effects of culture.
Probably anything on Helmholtz as well.
Oh yes, well, Helmholtz is very difficult. There's a little book on Helmholtz, but I have to confess my German is not good enough to have read the original. I mean, the book that very much influenced me in early stages was this one,
Okay.
Borges.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And
what is it?
He has Labyrinths, it's called. But he has, I mean, they're all very short stories, but one of them is called Funes the Memorious, which is about someone who has some sort of brain damage, which means their memory is completely altered and they can remember everything. Their episodic memory is perfect, as a result of which they abandon concepts.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
Because they don't need to simplify.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
No, Chris, thanks. I mean, everybody, when people read it, when people read your work, when people read like people like Kristen's work, I mean, they're always curious, like, how do you guys get to the point where you are? Who are the thinkers who make you who you are? It's fascinating to see the journey you guys take to get to that point.
Yeah. Well, it's random, basically.
Because you guys are there for us. I mean, like one day if somebody asks me these questions, I'm going to say people like Chris Frith. I mean, so it's great to know who influenced you and who played that big role for you guys. Yeah. Do you think so, Chris? I mean, of course, it's mind-body solution. Do you think we're going to find a mind-body solution? We're going to solve this mind-body problem anytime soon?
I hope not.
Because then the magic is gone.
The magic is gone, yeah.
But honestly, thanks to you, at least the listeners, I've taken one step closer to the mind-body solution. And I really appreciate you accommodating me, knowing that we're having some horrible weather conditions here in South Africa.
I gather, yeah.
It's been crazy, like lots of flooding, lots of death. It's been quite intense.
Yeah. Right. But it's getting back to normal, is it? Right. Yeah.
So I appreciate your time and for rescheduling the meeting with me.
No, that was fine. Yeah. No, thanks. I've enjoyed this chat very much.
Thanks, Chris.